All right, so today we're diving deep into TopoNets,
TopoNets.
this new thing in AI everyone's talking about because it's trying to make AI
More like us.
more like us.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not about making AI bigger or faster anymore, right?
Right. It's about asking if the way the brain is structured is the key to how it learns.
Okay, so brains,
Brains.
neurons,
Yeah.
we know they're not just thrown in there randomly.
It's clustered.
They're clustered by what they do. Like you get your face recognizing crew over here,
Exactly.
your language processing team over there.
It's called topographic organization, and AI models, even the really fancy ones, they don't usually have that.
Yeah.
It's all just a jumble.
So it's a jumble. So the question is, if we give AI that brain like layout,
Would it learn better?
would it learn better or even learn in a totally new way?
Totally new way. Yeah.
And you sent over some research on how they're actually doing this with models we've all heard of,
Yeah.
ResNets,
ResNets.
GPT,
GPT.
even vision transformers.
Transformer. Uh-huh.
But this wasn't the first attempt at this brain-like AI, was it?
No. Nope. There were
There were
others.
others.
Some just rearranged the existing AI neurons after training,
Yeah.
like tidying up a messy room.
Hmm.
Doesn't change what the room does.
Right.
Other methods tried to force topography during training.
And did that work?
It kind of worked.
Kind of.
They ended up with models that were more brain-like, but they performed worse on like image recognition tasks.
Really?
Yeah, it was almost like you could have one or the other. You could have a brain-like structure or you could have good performance,
Oh,
but not both.
so where does TopoLoss fit into all this?
TopoLoss.
The research seems to say this is the method that's kind of cracking the code.
It seems to be, yeah.
Yeah.
TopoLoss takes inspiration from synaptic pruning in the brain.
Okay.
It's kind of like our brains start with tons of connections, but as we learn, the ones that aren't useful get trimmed away.
So less is more.
Yeah, less is more decluttering for the brain.
Decluttering for the brain.
Exactly. TopoLoss analyzes the connections between neurons in the model, and it nudges the ones that are close together to specialize in similar things. So it
Ah.
creates these clusters, but it's subtly, it's not forcing it.
So not just throwing away connections randomly,
Oh, no.
but making them meaningfully sparse.
Meaningfully sparse. That's the key.
Okay.
They tested TopoLoss on a whole bunch of different AI models.
Okay.
ResNets for image stuff, GPT, and NanoGPT for language, even the vision transformer, which is totally different from the traditional models.
Right.
And there were two findings that really jumped out at me.
Okay, hit me.
All right, so first, TopoNets didn't just perform as well as the standard models. Sometimes they did better. Which was a surprise because a lot of experts thought brain-like structure would come at a performance cost, but it might actually be a benefit.
So maybe our brains are onto something after all.
Maybe.
What was the second surprise?
The second surprise was efficiency.
Okay.
TopoNets were much leaner.
Okay.
For one, because of how TopoLoss encourages sparseness.
Right.
You could easily remove tons of connections without hurting performance.
Right.
Like decluttering your room and finding out you can get rid of half your stuff and you still have everything you need.
So tidying up leads to a better, more efficient AI.
Exactly.
Okay. And what was the second way?
The second way had to do with parameters. You can think of parameters like the knobs and dials that an AI model uses.
Okay.
They found that they could massively shrink the number of parameters in TopoNets
Wow.
and still get great results.
Huh. This means less computing power is needed for really powerful AI, which is a huge deal. So less power, same great results, just like our own energy efficient brains.
Exactly.
But beyond just being efficient, did these TopoNets act more brain-like too?
They did, and this is where it gets really fascinating.
Okay.
Let's start with vision.
All right.
Remember how we talked about the brain having these dedicated areas for different kinds of visual information?
Yes.
Well, the TopoNets started showing similar specialization.
Wait, so they were developing clusters tuned to specific visual features?
Exactly. Clusters for faces, bodies, scenes, mirroring areas in our visual cortex.
No way.
And get this, they even mimicked the brain's preference for certain object sizes,
Oh.
showing they weren't just recognizing patterns, but organizing knowledge in a way similar to us.
That's wild.
It is.
They weren't even told to do that, but they kind of stumbled onto the same principles our brains use.
Which makes you wonder if the brain's way of organizing itself isn't just random,
Yeah.
but actually advantageous for some reason.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And what about the language models? Did those show brain-like behavior too?
Absolutely. Remember how we talked about the brain having neurons that work on different timescales?
Uh-huh.
Some focusing on recent words and others integrating information over longer stretches of text.
Right, like short-term memory versus putting together meaning over time.
Exactly. Well, the TopoNet started to show that kind of clustering, too.
No way. So some neurons in the model were acting like short-term memory while others were more long-term?
You got it. Clusters emerged focusing on recent words, short time scale, and others on words much earlier in the text, longer time scale.
Amazing. The body spontaneously developed a system for processing language over time, just like the brain.
Just like the brain.
This is all blowing my mind, but I'm sure our listeners thinking, okay, that's cool, but what's in it for me?
Well, if you're interested in AI's future, TopoNets point to a new direction.
Okay.
Not just bigger models, but smarter ones that mimic our own cognitive efficiency.
Like AI running on your phone without draining the battery in 5 minutes.
Exactly. And for those of you curious about the brain, TopoNets suggests that our messy neural layout might be key to how we learn and adapt.
Hmm.
And if you're in a more technical field, imagine designing AI that needs less power or is more robust to errors, all thanks to taking inspiration from the brain.
Okay, so this TopoNet research is clearly a big deal, but before we move on, there's something that really caught my eye in the research that I want to point out.
Okay, let's hear it.
When they were analyzing those language models,
Yeah.
they found this one cluster that was totally unexpected.
Oh,
It wasn't part of the usual short-term versus long-term memory thing. It seemed to be doing something completely different,
that is interesting.
right? So the question is, what's this mystery cluster doing? Could it be a whole new way of understanding language comprehension, both in AI and in ourselves?
Now that's a question worth diving into.
It is.
But let's save that for part 2. That mystery cluster really highlights how, even when we're trying to mimic the brain, AI research can stumble upon something totally new. It underscores how much we still don't know about AI and ourselves.
Totally. It's like we're holding a mirror up to the brain, and the reflection shows us something we didn't expect. Okay, let's get a bit more to the nitty-gritty of how these TopoNets are actually built. The research mentions this cortical sheet thing, which sounds pretty technical.
It is.
What's that all about?
So it's basically a way to represent the brain's layout in an AI model. You know how we talked about how the brain isn't just a random jumble of neurons, it's organized.
Right. It's
It's a map of the brain, but for an AI.
exactly. It's like a 2D sheet where each point represents a neuron in the model, and TopoLoss uses that location information to encourage nearby neurons to specialize.
So it's not just about connections, but their arrangement in this virtual space.
Right. For models like transformers, they reshape the connections between neurons into this 2D sheet. For convolutional models like ResNets, they project the weights onto the sheet. It's all about mapping the structure onto this 2D representation. Okay, cool. But how does all this actually make the model more efficient? You mentioned weight sparseness and parameter efficiency, but how does that actually happen?
Okay, so let's start with weight sparseness. Remember how TopoLoss encourages neurons close together on the sheet to specialize?
Yeah.
Well, that means some connections between neurons become way more important than others.
So if a bunch of neurons are all doing similar things,
Uh-huh.
they're relying on the same inputs, making those connections stronger.
Exactly. The important connections get stronger and the irrelevant ones get weaker. TopoLoss leads to a model where a lot of the connections are basically useless.
Like finding out you can get rid of half the stuff in your closet and still have everything you need, so you just get rid of them.
That's the pruning part. They found that they could prune a huge percentage of the weakest connections in a TopoNet without really affecting performance because those weak connections weren't contributing much anyway.
So defluttering leads to a more efficient AI, got it. But what about parameter efficiency?
Okay, so think of downsampling an image.
Okay,
You reduce the number of pixels, making the image smaller.
right.
They apply a similar concept to the cortical sheet. Downsampling the sheet means reducing the number of neurons in the model.
Isn't that like making the model dumber?
You'd think so, but because TopoLoss has already pushed the model to have that specialized clustered structure, you can remove some neurons, and the remaining ones are still organized in a way that captures the important stuff from the data.
It's like you're removing bricks from a wall, but the wall stays up because the remaining bricks are arranged in a strong pattern.
Exactly. They found they could downsample the cortical sheets a lot without tanking performance. Fewer neurons means less computational cost.
So by combining weight sparseness and parameter efficiency, they're making AI models that are both leaner and meaner.
That's it.
They've packed a lot of intelligence into a smaller package.
All thanks to inspiration from the brain.
Okay, I'm really seeing why everyone's so excited about this, but let's get back to those brain-like behaviors. We talked about the vision models, but I'm curious about the language models.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. Remember those temporal receptive fields in the brain, how some neurons focus on recent words while others integrate information over longer stretches?
Yeah, those neurons are tuned to different timescales for processing language.
Well, they found something similar in the TopoNets trained on language tasks. The neurons were clustered based on their temporal receptive fields.
So some clusters were acting like short-term memory while others were more long-term.
Exactly. They found clusters sensitive to recent words, short timescale, and others sensitive to words much earlier in the text, longer timescale.
Amazing, the model spontaneously developed a system for processing language over time, just like the brain.
And remember that mystery cluster?
Oh yeah,
The one that didn't fit the usual patterns?
what's the deal with that?
They don't have a definitive answer, but they speculate it might be involved in even higher level language processing, maybe picking up patterns across sentences or even paragraphs, showing a level of comprehension beyond just individual words.
Whoa, so these TopoNets might be showing us forms of language understanding we don't even fully get yet.
It's a real possibility, and that's what makes this so exciting. It's not just about building better AI, it's about using AI to understand ourselves better.
Okay, before we get too existential, there's something the research mentions as a potential limitation, this scaling factor called TOPM, that controls how strongly they enforce topographic organization during training. What's up with that?
It's basically a knob you can turn to adjust how brain-like you want the model to be. High TOPN means strong organization, low TOP means a more relaxed approach.
So wouldn't you want the strongest organization possible, make it as brain-like as you can?
It's not that simple. Remember the trade-off we talked about between structure and performance in those earlier attempts?
Right.
Finding the right balance is still tricky, too strong, and it might actually hurt the model's ability to learn.
Because it's too rigid, too stuck in that predefined structure.
Exactly, like fitting a square peg in a round hole. If the structure's too rigid, the model can't adapt to the data.
So finding the right setting for image is key too low, and you don't get enough organization too high, and you might end up with a less capable model.
Right, it's about finding that sweet spot where the model is both brain-like and high-performing, and they admit there's more work to be done to figure out how to set it optimally for different models and tasks.
Makes sense. It's still early days for this research, so there's a lot more to explore, but even now the results are pretty amazing.
They really are. TopoNets offer a glimpse into an AI future that's not just powerful, but efficient, interpretable, and maybe even a bit more human.
So you're saying we should all be paying attention to this?
Absolutely. If you're at all interested in where AIs is heading, TopoNets are a sign that things are about to get much more interesting. We're moving beyond just making models bigger. Now we're taking cues from the brain, aiming for efficiency, robustness, and ultimately more intelligence.
And for those more into the brain itself,
TopoNets offer a new way to look at our own cognitive processes. Studying how these models work could help us understand why our brains are organized the way they are and how that organization contributes to learning and adapting.
it's like AI is helping us understand ourselves, and for those in more technical fields, TopoNets offer a whole new toolkit for building AI systems. Imagine designing AI that needs less processing power or is more resistant to errors, all thanks to the brain.
The possibilities are pretty mind-blowing. Okay, so we've explored how TopoNets are built, how they achieve efficiency, and how they exhibit some uncanny brain-like behavior. But let's loop back to that mystery cluster one last time. It's the perfect cliffhanger.
Isn't it a tantalizing clue that there's still so much we don't know? For our listener, the question remains, what secrets might that cluster hold? Could it be the key to unlocking a deeper level of language understanding in both AI and ourselves?
That is the million-dollar question.
And it's a question that we might just have to revisit as TopoNet research continues to unfold. Until then, makes you wonder if we're like on the verge of some huge breakthroughs, not just in AI, but in how we understand our own brains.
Yeah, it really feels like AI and neuroscience are kind of starting to merge, learning from each other, pushing each other forward.
Before we wrap up, there's one more thing the research mentioned that caught my eye. TopoNets might be really good at something called compressing large language models.
Compressing.
Yeah, what's that all about?
So this is another area where TopoNets could be revolutionary large language models, things powering chatbots and text generators.
Right.
They're powerful, but they're resource hogs.
Uh-huh.
They need tons of computing power, which makes them expensive and not very accessible.
I've heard training these massive models can cost millions and use as much energy as like a small town.
Exactly. So there's a big push to make them more efficient, to
Yeah.
shrink them down without losing their capabilities.
Right.
And TopoNets might be the answer. Remember how they're naturally more sparse and efficient because of their organization.
Yeah, the synaptic pruning and downsampling let them do more with less.
Right. They think those properties could be used to compress large language models, potentially making them much smaller and more accessible without sacrificing performance.
So it's like taking this huge complex model and making it leaner and more streamlined.
That's the idea. And if it works, it could change how we develop and use large language models. In the future, we could see AI that's more powerful, cheaper, and more sustainable.
So to bring it all back to our listener, TopoNets aren't just a cool new development. They're a potential game changer.
I think so. They represent a fundamental shift in how we approach building AI. It's not just about bigger and more complex anymore. It's about taking inspiration from the brain and building AI that's more efficient, interpretable, and maybe even more human.
So you're saying our listeners should be paying attention.
Absolutely. This is the kind of research that has the potential to reshape the field of AI. And who knows, maybe it'll help us understand our own minds a little better along the way.
Well, if you're as fascinated by TopoNets as we are, we encourage you to dive into the research yourself. You've got the links in your show notes. Until then, keep those brains buzzing. Oh, our listeners got something to share. Let's hear it.
Hey there. I'm a little confused about TopoLoss. So, can we relate brain and TopoLoss? So, what's the connection between it?